So another big issue that we have been pursuing, I talked about Soros a little bit, but you should know, generally speaking, the State Department, to the degree it interferes in foreign countries, it's usually for the side of the transnational left. I mean, if you're a center-right or conservative government, you can almost always count that the establishment State Department, the career foreign service, are your opponents. And we've demonstrated in country after country how, at least during the Obama administration, they were working with Soros-connected organizations and other left-wing groups to undermine conservative governance abroad. And in Guatemala, it's especially acute because it's in Central America that we're, as a result of that destabilization that occurs with this attack on sensible governance. And look, I'm under no illusion about the corruption of center-right or conservative governments in Central and South America. I understand there's corruption abroad. I do understand also that more socialism, this is the less big thing, is more independent more independent judiciary in these countries is a solution to combating corruption. Actually, it's usually the opposite. It's a vehicle for imposing socialism. I mean, just think of the left's approach to judicial issues here in the United States. They rely on judges to impose their will over the consent of the governed. And that's what they do in these other countries. It's actually even worse because the judicial function is often prosecutorial and the judges can then throw and authorize political opponents to get arrested. So in Guatemala, you had this nasty mix of the UN, the State Department, and these NGOs, some of whom are supported by the Soros foundations, working to undermine the center-right government in Guatemala. And when you undermine the effectiveness of governments, like I said, in Guatemala, places like that, you want to know why we have caravans? And the the UAC, the unaccompanied minor crisis, and the family units, and all the asylum craziness, the collapse of our southern border. It's because of the leftist attacks on these governments, and they essentially encourage these caravans as well, which is another issue. So what we've done is we've sued for documents on Obama's and Obama UN effort to undermine elected government in Guatemala. And we're not the only ones concerned about it. Todd Robinson, who is, and this is typical of the State Department. Todd Robinson, Obama's former ambassador to Guatemala, is now a senior advisor to the State Department. And he reportedly worked with this left-wing group, this UN group, again, to try to impose this left-wing agenda in Guatemala. It's called CICG, and it was, quote, politicizing the judiciary down there. An academic study of that group by a local, I think a Guatemalan political science professor, said that CICIG, actually UN, has also been criticized for the very same reasons others have praised it, becoming a player in judicial appointments, proposing some controversial reforms to the Guatemalan Constitution, and the use of televised conferences to shift the public in its favor. From this perspective, instead of strengthening Guatemalan institutions, the Commission is making national institutions dependent on its assistance. So these nonprofits or UN-oriented groups can come in, and they don't need to have a lot of money in a place like Guatemala to have an outside influence. They control aid, they have access to resources that the government and its political opponents can't ever hope to match. So that's why it's important to track what's going on here, because as we're worrying about what's going on in the United States, the left, often with your taxpayer resources, is working its will all over the world. We've uncovered how that was going on in Macedonia. You see this issue in Ukraine as well. These Soros groups supposedly are anti-corruption, but they're political players. that come down on one side of the political spectrum, it looks like. Certainly they were anti-Trump, it looks like. And of course, as has been alleged, you had, again, a career Foreign Service officer who became an ambassador, Yovanovitch, allegedly intervening on their behalf. So thankfully, this UN group was essentially allowed, was told that it couldn't stay around, and its ability to function in Guatemala lapsed and wasn't renewed. But we want to know what was going on. They were doing this in Macedonia. They had the Soros groups attacking the conservative government in Hungary. It's going on in Poland. You know, Soros is a billionaire. He doesn't need our help. And if Soros was a, let's say Soros was a, let's come up with another name, John Smith, French billionaire. How would you feel if John Smith, French billionaire, came here to the United States and started subsidizing and creating groups out of whole cloth to impact public policy here, to advance his far left views? Would you be concerned about that? Well, that's what's happening with Soros abroad. He comes in, spends his money to influence policies in other countries, subvert governments that he doesn't like. So as you might imagine, it's quite controversial. And on top of that, these same groups that he's subsidizing, the State Department often works with and subsidizes as well. That's what we're getting at. And Soros tries to scare anyone off now from criticizing him by smearing them, suggesting they're doing it for improper reasons. Like the left, they call you names for asking questions about their conduct, but we're not stopping. I mean, we keep on suing. So this is why I love Judicial Watch. We are challenging, we're keeping watch abroad, we're keeping watch here in Washington, D.C., we do litigation in the States. There's nothing like us in Washington, D.C. There's nothing like us in the United States. And dare I say it, there's nothing like Judicial Watch in the world. And for all the complaints we have about the crisis here in Washington, D.C. and the corruption here in America, it's much worse abroad. That's why we fight so strongly, because we do not want that type of corruption that we now hear about in Ukraine. Do we want that to be the everyday norm here in Washington, D.C.? Of course not. And as a conservative, I recognize that the bigger government gets, the more corruption there will be. And of course, you need more secrecy to ensure that corruption.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch all the latest news from Judicial Watch.